Emily stepped onto the plane with quiet confidence, clutching her first-class ticket. She wasn't dressed in designer labels or dripping in jewelry, just a simple yet elegant outfit that reflected her humble nature. As she walked down the luxurious aisle, she noticed the glances, subtle at first, then more obvious. She could feel their judgment, but she ignored it and took her seat near the window. A well-dressed woman sitting beside her frowned, looking her up and down. "Excuse me, I think you might be in the wrong seat," she said, her tone laced with condescension. Emily smiled politely. "No, this is my seat," she replied, placing her bag underneath. The woman scoffed and waved over a flight attendant. "There must be a mistake. This woman does not belong here." The flight attendant, a tall woman with a professional demeanor, approached and glanced at Emily before looking at her ticket. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Ma'am, are you sure this is your seat?" Emily nodded, handing her the ticket. The flight attendant inspected it, then hesitated before looking back at her. "This is a first-class seat," she said slowly. "Yes, I know," Emily replied patiently. The woman beside her rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. I spend more on handbags than she does on her entire outfit. There's no way she can afford this." A few other passengers chuckled. Emily felt a flush rise in her cheeks but kept her composure. "I paid for this seat," she said firmly. The flight attendant pursed her lips, then sighed. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me." Emily hesitated. "Why?" The attendant lowered her voice. "We need to verify your ticket." Emily glanced around. The whispers, the judging stares. It was humiliating. But she didn't argue. She picked up her bag and walked toward the back of the plane, feeling the weight of their assumptions with every step. As the plane touched down, Emily exhaled softly, relieved that the flight was over. The humiliation of being removed from first class still lingered, but she had no interest in causing a scene. She collected her bag and prepared to exit, keeping her head high despite the judgmental looks from some passengers. As she stepped into the terminal, she spotted a familiar figure standing near the arrival gate. Richard Sterling, her husband, and the CEO of the airline, was waiting for her. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, his presence commanding attention. His expression softened the moment he saw her, but when he noticed her tense posture, his brows furrowed with concern. "Emily," he said, striding toward her, "is everything all right?" Before she could respond, the same flight attendant who had questioned her on the plane froze mid-step, her face draining of color as she recognized Richard. The snobbish woman from first class, still clutching her designer handbag, stopped in her tracks, looking from Emily to Richard in disbelief. Emily smiled gently at her husband, appreciating the warmth in his voice. "I'm fine," she said, but Richard could sense something was off. A uniformed airline manager approached quickly, bowing his head slightly. "Mr. Sterling, we weren't aware that your wife was on this flight. Had we known—" Richard cut him off with a sharp look. "Had you known what? Would you have treated her differently?" His voice was calm, but there was a clear edge to it. The flight attendant took a hesitant step forward, her hands clasped nervously. "Sir, I didn't realize she was... she didn't look like..." Richard's jaw tightened. "She didn't look rich enough for first class? Is that what you were about to say?" The woman swallowed hard, unable to meet his gaze. Other staff members and passengers who had witnessed Emily's humiliation began whispering amongst themselves. The snobbish passenger, who had been so vocal before, suddenly found the floor very interesting. Richard turned back to Emily, his expression softening. "Tell me what happened." Emily hesitated. She had never liked making a fuss, but she also knew this was about more than just her. "They assumed I didn't belong in first class," she admitted. "They made me move to economy without even giving me a chance to explain." Richard's eyes darkened with disappointment. He turned back to the flight crew and staff. "I built this airline on principles of respect and fairness," he said, his voice carrying through the terminal. "If this is how you treat my wife, I can only imagine how you treat others." The flight attendant looked like she wanted to disappear. The snobbish passenger took a step back, her face red with shame. Richard turned to Emily, gently taking her hand. "Come on," he said, "let's make sure this never happens again." As they walked away together, Emily didn't look back. She didn't need to. The message had already been received. Richard led Emily through the terminal, his grip on her hand firm but gentle. His expression remained calm, but she could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. She had never seen him truly angry, but she knew he took integrity seriously, especially when it came to the company he had built from the ground up. Behind them, the whispers continued. Some passengers from the flight had pieced together the truth, and the flight attendants shifted nervously, realizing the gravity of their mistake. The snobbish woman from first class hovered awkwardly nearby, suddenly stripped of the superiority she had flaunted just hours earlier. A group of airline executives and senior staff rushed forward, having heard that their CEO was at the terminal. The head of customer service, an older man with a dignified presence, cleared his throat. "Mr. Sterling, I assure you, we had no idea your wife was on board. This is not how we typically treat our first-class passengers." Richard turned sharply. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it?" His voice, though measured, carried a weight that made the entire group stiffen. "You shouldn't treat first-class passengers differently than anyone else. My wife's status should not be the reason you suddenly care about respect and dignity." The flight attendant who had removed Emily from first class swallowed hard, her hands twisting together. "Sir, I was just following protocol. She didn't look like—" Richard held up a hand, silencing her. "Don't finish that sentence." His eyes locked onto hers. "You're saying she didn't look wealthy enough? So you assume she didn't belong?" The woman's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Richard took a slow breath. "Listen carefully. I didn't build this airline for the rich and powerful alone. I built it to provide comfort, safety, and respect for all passengers. If my wife had been someone else, a teacher, a nurse, or a mother traveling alone, would you have treated her any differently?" No one spoke. The weight of his words settled over them like a heavy blanket. Richard turned to the head of customer service. "I want an immediate review of training procedures. Every staff member will undergo new customer service training, emphasizing respect for every passenger, regardless of how they look." "Yes, sir," the man said quickly, nodding. The snobbish woman from first class took a nervous step forward, forcing a weak smile. "Mr. Sterling, I had no idea she was your wife," she stammered. Emily raised a hand gently. "It's not about who I'm married to," she said with a calm grace that made the woman shrink back. "It's about kindness, about treating people well, regardless of what they wear or how much money they have." Richard smiled at his wife, admiration flickering in his eyes. "Exactly." He turned back to the gathered staff. "This will never happen again," he stated firmly. "Not to my wife, not to anyone." The tension in the room hung thick, but the message was clear. As Richard and Emily walked away together, the flight attendant let out a shaky breath, and the passengers who had once judged Emily now watched her with quiet awe. True class wasn't about wealth, it was about how you treated people, and they had just learned that lesson the hard way.